Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, the Supreme Court is a job for life, theirs and ours. What will our lives look like if Samuel Alito is confirmed? We'll speak with constitutional law expert Jamie Raskin. Then, just how vulnerable to major storms is America's natural gas supply? We ask Navin Nayak of the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. Hurricane Katrina caused numerous threats to human health, and to animals too. Public Health Service veterinarian Tori reports on her relief efforts on the Gulf Coast. We're joined by playwright and poet Sibby Sullivan, who's out with a CD of her poetry recorded by various artists. Also, poetry by Kim Roberts and Naomi Ayala. And What About Me sings Whammy honoree Leanna. All on the Coffee House. Forum at the Coffee House. Nothing, it seemed, nothing would ever unglue the bond between conservative commentators and President Bush. Not a war to rid Iraq of phantom weapons of mass destruction, not the appointment of a totally inept FEMA director, not even a ballooning national deficit. To the right wing, the president could do no wrong. And then Bush nominated Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court. You know, I'd like to believe that William Kristol and Charles Krauthammer couldn't suffer yet another Bush League crony entrusted with a pivotal office of public trust. But is that really why the right went ballistic and Miers went down in flames? Or is it they didn't trust her politics and that she would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade? Whatever Harriet's history, and the right got what it wanted when Bush nominated Samuel Alito. Alito's clearly a smart, experienced judge, and on a personal level, by most accounts, a pleasant fellow. So why all the fuss? Let's ask constitutional law expert Jamie Raskin. Jamie is a professor at American University's Washington College of Law and a magna cum laude graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School. Welcome back to the Coffee House, Jamie.
My pleasure to be here with you, Mark.
People for the American Way, Move On, a lot of organizations have come out very strongly, very early against Judge Alito's nomination for the Supreme Court. What's the deal? Why is there so much controversy about him?
Well, for the same reason there's so much jubilation in the Federalist Society and among the right-wingers. I mean, this is precisely the guy they've been grooming for the Supreme Court and the kind of judge they've been grooming for the Supreme Court for 2 decades now. And Harriet Miers was ideologically uncertain from the perspective of some of them, but in any event, all of them saw her as someone whose qualifications were mediocre at best, not having been a judge, not having gone to a fancy Ivy League school, not having clerked in the Supreme Court. And so it's critical to the Federalist Society agenda. They find people who have central casting credentials to dress up the ideological agenda in. So even if they knew that Harriet Miers was going to be a down-the-line movement conservative, the way that Alito is, it's still tough because they need someone who also gives the appearance of being like John Roberts, who gave that spectacular performance in the Judiciary Committee. So,
and now is the Chief Justice.
And now is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So Alito, if you look at his record, gives the most cramped, constricting construction of civil rights statutes, of employment statutes, of sex discrimination statutes, the most extensive possible interpretation to executive branch power, to government powers over people's private lives. And so there's no coherence to the jurisprudence other than they're going with the conservative ideological test.
Okay, we'll come back to the specifics about Judge Alito and let's talk a little bit about why do you think Harriet Miers failed as a candidate?
Well, there were several things. One, David Souter. Now remember, Souter was named by this Bush's father at the recommendation of John Sununu, who brought him down from New Hampshire. And the liberals, including Teddy Kennedy, were opposed to him because they thought he was a stealth candidate and he was a stalking horse for a conservative agenda. Turned out to be the most progressive justice we have on the Supreme Court. In fact, the 2 most justices we've got right now are Republican appointees, David Souter and Justice Stevens, whom Ford named to the court. So the mantra in the Republican Party has been no more suitors. That is, we want to exactly where this person stands on everything, and we want to make sure they're one of our midst and our ranks. And so Miers came. She'd been on the Dallas City Council. She had served with African Americans and Hispanics, and she had, made positive noises about affirmative action in the past and said some positive things about a woman's right to choose. At the same time, she called for a constitutional amendment, but they saw her as uncertain and unstable, in any event, betraying the Federalist Society formula, which is to send someone straight through the Ivy League, clerk on the Supreme Court, go work at the Department of Justice, go work in the Office of Legal Counsel, have an executive branch career, champion of the presidency and strong presidential powers and war powers, and then we'll bring you to the bench and we'll bring you up that way. That wasn't Harriet Miers. So that was a big problem for her. The other problem that a lot of people haven't focused on is that she was 60 years old. Roberts was perfect for them. He's 50 years old. So given where we are with modern medicine, his longevity is probably another 25, 30, 40 years maybe. They saw Miers as someone who wasn't necessarily going to be around that long, and they want, a long-distance justice.
And on many issues, this is the swing vote.
Well, we're losing O'Connor, and O'Connor has certainly tilted to the right on a lot of things, but on the social issues, on abortion rights, on women's equality, on affirmative action, she has sided with the moderates and liberals on the court to defend the landmark precedents of the last couple of decades. Someone like Judge Alito, who is a soldier waiting for battle from the right wing, is going to be trying to attack all of those precedents. I mean, he would take aim at affirmative action very early. In the Casey decision, the abortion rights decision, where the Supreme Court weakened the Roe versus Wade standard and said that government can regulate abortion as long as there's no undue burden, he went even further on the Third Circuit, which was the circuit where the case came from, and said not only is it okay to have a 24-hour waiting period, not only is it okay to make the doctors give women kind of slanted information, not only is it okay to have parental consent laws, it's okay to have a spousal notification law, which requires women to go and notify their husband and then certify that they've notified the husband of their intention to get an abortion. And Justice O'Connor said, hey, wait a second. It's okay for minors, but you can't treat grown women like minors. The vast majority will consult their husbands if they're in a good relationship, but the ones who are not should not be forced by the state to go and get their husband's sign off in some way for the decision. And
so most people believe that although he hasn't had to rule on this decision directly, that if given the opportunity, he would overrule a woman's right to choose.
I mean, if you don't think he's going to overrule Roe versus Wade and Casey, you're too innocent to be let out of the house by yourself. The right wing has been saying, well, despite the Casey decision, in several other cases he reaffirmed the right of abortion, which is true, every time citing the fact that there was a Supreme Court decision controlling his opinion as a mere federal appeals court judge. So he's not going to be in that position anymore. He's going to be driving the bus, and I think we know where it's going to take us.
You said several times before that he's going to overturn precedent if he gets onto the Supreme Court. But most of the defense of him is that, in fact, he's very deferential to precedent and that he follows precedent, perhaps the exception being on the Casey decision. Do you see him not following precedent in the areas of affirmative action, employment law, those areas as well?
Well, the Supreme Court is always writing on a clean slate because no one is higher than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not final because they're infallible. They're infallible because they're final. You can't appeal, in most cases, anywhere else. This is a guy who has a very strong ideological agenda. He knows where he's going. And the truth is, any justice is willing to overturn a precedent ordinarily that they think was wrongly decided. So the real question is, what is your constitutional philosophy? And the big divide here is between the liberals who think that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights should be read as a charter of rights for the people, and the powers of the government have to be read principally through the rights and liberties of the people and the system of democratic government. The conservatives believe that the powers of the government come first, and the rights of the people should be read through the powers of government. And so that's why we get a conservative administration like the Bush administration saying that they have the power to hold U.S. citizens without giving them a lawyer, without allowing them to see a lawyer or have due process or go before a judge simply by pasting a label on them.
Now, the right traditionally would argue that those positions are actually inverted, that what the right stands for is the right of the individual versus the government, whereas the left, the liberals, support the right of the government, the community, to trump that of the individual.
The only time you hear that rhetoric is with respect to property rights. And there might be some truth in that some of the conservative justices are more concerned about property rights than the liberals, although it depends on whose property rights. For example, the most important class action suit in American history is going on right now. It's been going on for many years by American Indians who are suing to get a simple accounting of their property that's been taken by the U.S. government and mismanaged for over 100 years. Tens of millions of acres of Indian lands have been held nominally in trust for the Indians, except the money's disappeared, the land has been used by oil and gas and timber interests. But what's interesting is there is a conservative Republican judge on this case, Judge Lambert in the District of Columbia, who has said this is an outrageous violation of property rights and these people have a right to an accounting and to get their money back. So the best Republicans really believe in that. The other ones, they're much more interested in corporate power and the rights of property for the wealthy. And that's about the only time you'll really see them interested in individual rights. But when it comes to civil rights cases and civil liberties cases, First Amendment cases, it's the liberals who are standing up for people's rights against the state.
One of the things I've noticed in looking at some of Judge Alito's decisions that strikes me is that he makes it very difficult, it seems to me, for a plaintiff in an employment case or a discrimination case to ever get the case to the trier of fact to a jury.
Let me give you an example of it. There was a case in the Third Circuit where a woman worked as a waitress and was promoted to kind of a maitre d' kind of position, but she was being sexually harassed. She filed a sexual harassment complaint under Title VII and then got demoted, reassigned. So she filed, in her lawsuit, the restaurant claimed all of these reasons for why it had nothing to do with the fact that she'd filed the sexual harassment complaint. And then the district court said, okay, we're going to kick your complaint out. Well, she appealed saying, I've got a right to explain why those were made-up reasons. Those were trumped-up reasons. The Third Circuit agreed with her, overwhelmingly, every judge in the court, except for Judge Alito, who said, no, as soon as the restaurant comes back with some justification, which they claim is the real reason that she was demoted, it rests at that. And I can cite you case after case like that, where he's always working to make sure a plaintiff doesn't get to a jury. And in the process, by the way, he's totally cutting the heart out of the congressional statute. He's always trying to undermine what Congress has set up for people to get a fair hearing in a civil rights suit.
Let's say that groups like Move On and People for the American Way were successful in blocking the nomination of Judge Alito. Is there any reason to believe that President Bush will nominate somebody who would be more favorable to a more judicious, more fair approach to serving on the Supreme Court?
Probably not. He might go right back to the same pool of right-wing judges, like Edith Jones or Edith Clement, or, there's a whole host of them who set up their careers in this way. But there are, interestingly, a number of Republican, moderate, conservative judges who I think would be very acceptable and who are people who believe in some honest approach with real integrity to the rule of law as opposed to simply driving an ideological agenda. And that's what we've got, where there really is no line of distinction between the Republican Party philosophy and the philosophy of the Federalist Society and the people who are their judges. You can't find any place where they come into collision with each other.
Well, many thanks to Professor Jamie Raskin for sharing his insights about the Supreme Court and nominee Samuel Alito. Senate hearings on the nomination aren't until January, so there's plenty of time for a frank public dialogue about what's at stake and who holds this Supreme Court seat. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
The sound fills the front yard, expanding, bouncing against the wooden fence and rising on a sluice of wind. A satisfied bark, smug with the fulfillment of its destiny, full-throated, repetitive, and sharp. Clearly, the yard can't contain it. An agent of heavenly providence, it takes off down the block, waking the sleepers, drowning televisions, banging at strangers' doors. Very soon, the vagabond bark encompasses a grid of streets, a school, a park, with the astonished mouth of a stringless basketball hoop. The rudderless bark knows no weather, can't distinguish night from day. It is a thing unstoppable, until, of course, it stops, and then the neighborhood turns its windows inside out. The very cars are hushed, knowing a great presence has abandoned its mechanics, and we turn to one another in hoarse silence.
I don't know anything about horses. I only see them in some of the dogs that walk through here, see them in the bear I've seen at the zoo. Dark is all these things that remind me of horses. Dark like the wind against the street with its light bulb eyes. Dark like you own the ground and your own running. This is the year of my horses. They leap from my skin and let loose on the block, bare back. This is the year. I speak hoarse with my skin and own the language of hoofs hitting the ground. My wind and my way out. I came with horses into this dark of no wind, prepared and unprepared.
Welcome to 21st Century Life here at the Coffee House. While Hurricane Katrina no longer dominates the front page, she continues to affect Americans from coast to coast. In our region, Water Cooler Talk now features growing complaints about rising home heating bills as the weather turns colder. Like the rest of the nation, we can expect in this region to pay nearly 50% more to heat our homes this winter, thanks in large part to the hurricane. This ferocious storm completely destroyed 46 oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and for weeks, she shut down nearly a third of America's total production. 9 refineries were also shut down, at least temporarily, sending gasoline prices above $5 per gallon in some parts of the country. One oil platform in Louisiana actually washed up on a shore in Alabama. Hence the double-digit increases in home heating in our region. And hence the question, if one storm can wreak such havoc on our national energy system, isn't it time to rethink the rationality of that system? Whatever your views on global warming and air pollution, do you really want your gasoline and heating budget totally dependent on a remarkably fragile network of pipelines and platforms and refineries set down right smack in the middle of the world's busiest hurricane alley? Do we have better options here? My guest today to discuss this issue is Navin Nayak. He is an environmental advocate with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group with an expertise in energy issues. Navin, welcome to the Coffee House.
Good to be here, Mike.
Let's start out by just discussing the importance of this quote-unquote, America's energy coast, the Gulf of Mexico. What does it mean to us in terms of energy?
All right, absolutely. To really understand the impact that Katrina and Rita have, you have to step back and just realize how dependent we are on the Gulf Coast for keeping our economy and our cars and our houses heated and keeping all that moving. We get 20% of our natural gas, which heats our homes and provides us electricity, from the Gulf Coast. We get 30% of our oil that we produce here in America from the Gulf Coast. Most of that goes into our cars to help us get from place to place. 50% of our refinery capacity is in the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Texas. And 60% of the oil that we import from all around the world comes through that one place. Mm-hmm. So a huge amount of our energy infrastructure is sitting right there. And when hurricanes Katrina and Rita came through there, massive impacts, and people know obviously the social and economic impacts, but just to our energy infrastructure, it's mind-blowing.
And it's still going on. I mean, even right now, we're more than 2 months past the hurricane, and what's the situation?
Absolutely. Here we are 2 months after the hurricane, and still 60% of our oil production in that region is not occurring. And 50% of our natural gas production in that region is still not occurring. There was a point in September where none of the oil production in that region was happening. 1.5 million barrels each day was not coming to our markets. And to give you a sense of how critical that was, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait way back in the early 90s, that had less of an impact than Hurricane Rita did in terms of the amount of oil that we had lost.
So Katrina and Rita both constituted more than Saddam Hussein in 1990 invading Kuwait, and we fought a war over that. Are we fighting a war, I mean, at least legislatively in terms of public policy in this country, a similar war to try to address this vulnerability? For example, the federal energy bill that was passed just in the last few weeks in Washington after years of battle, will it do anything to address this incredible vulnerability that sends our home heating fuel through the roof from one storm?
Absolutely not. In fact, Mike, it does the exact opposite. It takes more of our energy, eggs, so to speak, and sticks them in that same basket in that Gulf region. There are billions of dollars in subsidies to the oil and gas industry to go out on the Gulf Coast and drill more wells and drill more rigs.
In the same hurricane alley.
In that same place that's going to leave us even more vulnerable to that same kind of disasters.
Well, I mean, let's say I'm an elderly person on a fixed income in Washington, D.C. or Montgomery County. 50% more on average to heat my home this winter than last winter, and natural gas prices were already going up.
Right.
What's the solution? What can be done? Obviously, Washington is incentivizing more of this sort of drilling in this fragile region. What can average Americans do? I mean, what do we need?
I mean, well, the average American, obviously, there aren't a lot of options. You can find any opportunity to reduce your dependence on energy, but you got to heat your home. At the end of the day, we don't have an alternative to that. And the average person, as you mentioned, can expect to pay about $350 this winter, more than they did last winter. What we really need is some leadership on this issue. We need Congress to step up. We need politicians to stop pandering to the oil industry, and we need them to invest in solutions that we know will work. We need to diversify our energy supply. We get most of our energy from fossil fuels, which, as Katrina and Rita reminded us, are incredibly vulnerable. Instead of investing in alternative energy like renewables, instead of really investing in energy efficiency so that we're using less electricity, which allows us to save money as well for consumers and reduce our dependence.
You know, we need cars that get more miles to the gallon, and that happened after the great oil shocks of the 1970s. We actually got cars that really improved their miles per gallon efficiency. And now we're going back. I know that cars now in America get about the same miles per gallon average as in 1980. Yeah. You know, my question also is, we're all paying more for home heating, we're paying more for gasoline, and the oil companies, record profits. Talk about that.
Absolutely. And just a couple of weeks ago in October, the big five, all the oil companies released their profits. And just to give you one example, ExxonMobil, the biggest oil company in the world, privately owned oil company, recorded $10 billion in profits in 3 months. In 3 months, they made more money than giants like IBM and Time Warner make in an entire year.
How does that work? I mean, we're all paying more and more money, and it seems to be going right to their profit margins. How does that work?
Well, that's exactly a great point. The record profits are not the result of ExxonMobil having some grand business plan or some brand new investments that they've been able to recoup from. They're making billions more because you and I and the rest of consumers are paying billions more.
Where's the competition? I mean, why can't someone come in and undercut them? I mean, it seems like the market isn't working when they're making so much money at apparently the expense of people on fixed incomes in the Northeast trying to heat their homes.
Right. I think that's a great point, is that the industry wants to just scream, let the free market work, let the free market work. It's not working. You have 5 companies that control 50% of the oil production in this country. Those same 5 companies control 50% of the refining capacity, which is where the industry makes a lot of its money of late. And those same 5 companies control 62% of the gasoline and retail market. So until Congress steps in and tries to create some competition, those 5 companies have no reason to think about their prices or to think about consumers. They can pretty much do whatever they want because they control the show.
Well, Navin, you do a lot of work on Capitol Hill and a lot of pieces that you write about energy issues. Let's say you're a benevolent dictator or you're president tomorrow. What are the things that you would do to try to fix this problem? Originating in the Gulf Coast, 4,000 permanent structures out there drilling for oil, platforms vulnerable to hurricanes, natural gas prices going through the roof. What would you do?
Well, there's a set of things we need to do. You mentioned one of them, which is we need to get our cars to go further on a gallon of gasoline. It is completely absurd and fairly ridiculous to think that our cars today go as far on a gallon of gas as they did in 1980. I mean, think of all of the ways in which technology has changed, from cell phones to computers to iPods, yet the car you and I drive, on average, goes exactly the same distance. That's one of the things we need to do. Another is we need to put incentives and put incentives in the right place. Instead of providing billions of dollars to the oil and gas companies, we need to be incentivizing clean alternatives like renewables, like energy efficiency. It's absurd. We subsidize the oil and gas industry twice. We pay for the oil at the gas tank, but we're also paying them as taxpayers with billions of dollars of subsidies. That's absurd. We should be subsidizing cleaner alternatives, energy efficiency. And then the other thing that we would really like to see right now is there is a huge opportunity to tax these oil companies, to tax these excess windfall profits that they're enjoying, and to take those billions and billions of dollars and invest them in alternatives, invest them in hybrid technology, invest them in helping, even in the short term, helping people pay their heating bills, invest them in alternatives like mass transit so that people have choices and they don't have to get into their cars if there's something better to do.
So you would take the $10 billion that ExxonMobil made in the last 3 months, while the rest of us are paying, seeing our money for food and other things shrinking because we pay more for energy. Take some of that $10 billion, tax it, and use it to incentivize and diversify our energy portfolio. That sounds like a great idea.
Exactly.
Well, a big thanks to Navin Nayak for joining me to discuss Katrina, home heating prices, and a more sane energy future. As if global warming's impacts, melting ice caps and rising sea levels and agricultural disruptions weren't enough to encourage us to switch to clean energy, along comes a hurricane to add, pardon the expression, fuel to the fire. I'm Mike Tidwell, and this has been 21st Century Life.
Welcome to In Sickness and in Health at the Coffee House. The horror of New Orleans began on August the 29th, and its effects will be felt for a very, very long time. Among the many catastrophes that caught authorities by surprise was the plight of animals, whether family pets or wild creatures. Some were rescued, some skulked through the battered city or found refuge on rooftops, and others died and decayed where they fell. From this came many potential health risks that are still with New Orleans and that might arise anywhere disaster hits. Veterinarian Victoria Hampshire got a first-hand view of the devastation Katrina wrought and the hurricane's impact on pets and other animals. She is a member of the Uniformed Service of the U.S. Public Health Service. Tori, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you for having me.
Now, why did you go to New Orleans?
Well, we were asked if we would like to deploy as part of our Commissioned Corps Readiness Force, which is a segment of the Public Health Service that most officers belong to. And of all of the different health categories, the veterinarians were also asked to join to help provide humane care to the animals who were rescuees.
Could you describe what you saw when you got down there? It was fairly soon after the hurricane, was it not?
Right. I arrived within the first week of the response, and we had roughly a 10-member team of veterinarians. And basically what we were dealing with were animals that had been turned over from people who had to evacuate the city themselves. And we were based in 2 different shelters taking care of their pets.
So it was taking care of animals in the shelters, but also going out. Did you go and hunt down animals?
No, we didn't really do a lot of hunting down of the animals because the areas where they were basically isolated from traffic. They weren't safe really to be in, and so we were basically setting up shelters for the rescue squads and other people who were the emergency responders to bring the pets into the shelters from those areas.
And what was some of the health difficulties with these animals?
Well, the biggest difficulty was that they were very stressed and they were agitated. They were scared. Some of the ones who were owned had, of course, seen their owners leave, and some of them had been without food or water for several days. So we saw a lot of that, and we also saw their fur and their skin was quite damaged sometimes from too much water, too much moisture in the skin and fur, and many of them also had been starving for a few days.
So
dehydration.
Others went out and rescued them and brought them to you?
That's right.
And how did you locate the owners?
Well, by the time we got there, the Louisiana State University faculty had been running the emergency shelter as part of Louisiana's emergency response. The owners had either, as I said, they'd either turned over the animals to the state, or they had requested that somebody from an emergency response team go to the house where they lived and try to find their pets and bring them in. In some cases, they were found roaming and they had tags that identified them, but so they were brought in by the rescue staff for us.
We heard about packs of dogs in the streets.
Right.
How did that come about? They were pets who turned wild, or
some of them, and some of them were dogs that normally lived outside and formed packs as they went to find food and shelter, and they were rescued, and they were taken to a different shelter for animals where it was not clear whether they were owned or whether they were already feral and roaming the streets. But of course they became a public health concern because dogs roaming in packs will eventually start to try to find food, and sometimes the food is something you don't want them to eat.
Did they attack? Were there any stories of them attacking anybody?
Well, they did try to attack the people that were trying to help them often. There were no real stories of them hunting down people because there weren't many people left in the areas where they were roaming. Those people had already evacuated.
Perhaps hunting cats. No cats apparently left there.
No.
Some animals died because of the hurricane or not finding enough food. What happened to them? Did they just Was that one of the roles of your departments, to collect the dead animals?
Well, that was one of the original roles that was identified, but that wasn't really what we ended up doing. We were really providing more of the logistical support to the state shelters to try to take care for the overwhelming number. There were roughly 9,000 animals taken into the Gonzales facility at the Horse Expo Center, and the Public Health Service veterinarians participated heavily in helping in-process those animals and also ship them out to shelters outside of the state when they were already vaccinated and cared for and rehydrated if that's what they needed. And then we also provided a lot of the logistics, the husbandry and oversight of that husbandry was the role that we really participated in that was most useful to the state.
Okay, we've talked about dogs a lot and cats. There were not many of those, but what other kind of animals did you come across? I heard there was a seal even rescued at one stage.
I think, I've heard those stories too, but they were largely dogs and cats that were turned over. There were some large animals, of course, in the other areas, the farming areas, that were brought to the shelters as well or rescued.
Like
and
horses
and cows.
What about wild animals? Crocodiles coming into the center of New Orleans.
That was another, I think probably another, there were wild animals, snakes and other animals found in the streets by some of the rescue personnel as more or less nuisances, but they were really, that was not a big part of the response.
Now, as far as the risk to human health, I guess dogs roaming is a risk. And then did you have cases of dog bites or snake bites from displaced snakes? Or?
Dog bites was the overwhelming problem. The dogs, even the nicest dogs, were petrified under these circumstances, and so we were very dependent on volunteer workforces. We didn't sometimes know each day how we were going to take care of all the animals unless the volunteers showed up at the doors for us to help direct. And so dog bites became a real problem. I mean, really, we had to manage that, and we had to manage the paperwork that goes along with making sure that the person gets adequate prophylaxis for bacterial infections and that the animal is surveyed for any sort of disease like rabies that you would worry about, a zoonotic potential.
Were there any cases of rabies? Because that could quickly spread amongst the animals out there.
No, thankfully. Louisiana is not a state that has a great incidence of rabies anyway, but we did have to institute rabies prophylactic and bite procedures for dogs that were observed to have bitten somebody. We had to quarantine them and monitor their behavior.
Okay. Now, mosquitoes aren't exactly animals in the same sense, but they were a problem too. I believe they can carry disease. And was there any special attention you paid to that?
Sure, that was a big part of something we worried about quite a bit because the storm surge, of course, brings a larger influx of mosquitoes. It's very humid and hot that time of year anyway, and we were located in northwest of New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and there's a lot of water around there as well. So we were constantly watching for signs of mosquito-borne disease and working hard to keep the mosquito larvae at a minimum.
Okay. Now, people did leave their animals behind because they were told that they couldn't go to the shelters.
Right.
And then many of them took them when Hurricane Rita was going to strike, and then they were stuck on the highway for 15 hours, and thirsty dogs and cats perhaps was even worse, I don't know. But what can be done better in these kind of emergencies?
Well, I think what everyone has learned from this experience is that people are far more attached to their animals than one might believe, and they are considered family members. And so two things that we learned was that people are reluctant to leave their home without their animals. They do view themselves as the steward of their animals, and they feel they have an ethical responsibility to make sure they're cared for. Yeah. But the other problem is, as I said, our biggest nightmare every day was whether we were going to have enough people to take care of all of the animals. Remember, we had to put them in cages, which meant they had to be cleaned regularly. And so many of the things we were concerned about became lesser concerns, and just providing the husbandry that they needed was the real effort. So if you can bring the people with their animals to a shelter that serves both needs, then you minimize that concern quite a bit, because people quite readily enjoy taking care of their pets, especially when they don't have a home and they're sitting around a shelter themselves. It's something for them to do.
Right, so the policy may change in that regard, so they can go to emergency
Hopefully.
shelters.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Great, thank you. A very big thank you to veterinarian Tori Hampshire for sharing her experiences dealing with public health and animal welfare hazards in the hurricane-stricken Gulf Coast. I'm Kathy Christensen, and this has been In Sickness and in Health.
There's a tear falling in the moonlight. I think it's probably for me. You see, it's watched me trade time for what I wanted to be. But everybody trades memory for the future they see. What about me? I caught the early morning sunrise, 'cause sometimes I just can't sleep. I keep thinking of promises. I wonder if I can keep. But everybody makes promises at the time they meet. So what about me? What about me? What about me? I keep thinking of problems, things are wrong in my life, and praying that something will just make it right. Now I'm watching the sunset, and I'm filled with so much peace. It disappears in the Potomac, and this is where I should be. 'Cause sometimes we take chances, and we trust what's unseen. So what about me? What about me? What about me?
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Our guest is the author of award-winning plays and essays. Her fiction and poetry have appeared in a number of publications, including the recently issued CD entitled Little Wheel. She's also senior lecturer in university honors at the University of Maryland, College Park. Sibby O'Sullivan, welcome to the Coffee House.
Hello, Ruben.
Hi. I should also say my friend in the old school poetry wars. We go back a long way.
A long way.
Maybe someday we'll do a segment on
we should.
Back when poetry was really. But anyway, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I know that Sarah Plydell was on the show sometime back and did an excerpt from one of your other works, and you've really kind of taken the multitasking gift to another level, you know, poetry, plays, etc. And she did something from the body, correct?
Right,
which
a one-act
is
play.
Right.
The body.
And this is a different thing altogether. The
Yeah.
CD, right?
Yeah, Little Wheel is a collection of 13 of my poems read by 7 different readers, and there's some musical interlude. So I wanted to put my poems in an oral format.
So we're actually going to hear an excerpt from that.
I think so.
Yeah, and then we'll talk a bit about
Great.
how this came to be. So
we begin with the shoes, which have names like Oracle, Power, Courage. Next, the brassiers releasing their perfumed guests. A downward roll of waistbands, socks, a second's nakedness, and then the upward, strapping in, wiggle and hoist, buttocks to colorful cups, the adjusted cleft. At the pool's edge, fears mimic. Toes boggle the ladder. Inch by inch, our stomachs lowered like ordnance into the water, and then we are launched. A flotilla of cleavage and hairnets. Arms held akimbo by miracle bagels, styrofoam dumbbells at 20 a pop. We're told to resist, to turn and cross country and make the butt burn, to pump our flesh into flume, to scissor and scum, and finally to rest, to bat down the bubbles and come to rest. How long have we been suspended? How long will we dangle before we unhook and follow the heel, then the heart, down to the husbands castled below? Such tender reunion. They see us upwards, a kind of prophecy, shipwreck from another world. And for a moment we are younger, lighter, held in our zeros, girdled by foam. But too soon, the instructors, come back, waving us out of our azure forgetting. Come back to the dry weight of time, back to the ladder's cold staircase, our silver reversals. As water to air, we climb out of one grave and into another. The groove of our straps trenched in our shoulders, their kisses still stinging our heels.
Oh gosh, as I think as fans of your work have come so greedily to expect, that piece is replete with that lyricism and clarity that you know your best work.
I like that idea of those snapping husbands under the pool. I think that was what triggered this poem.
Yeah.
Who are we when we are hanging there, you know?
It's a good question.
I know.
And it's,
I have yet to answer.
Yeah.
But that idea of that kissing and that snapping.
I think that question could be the focal point for many segments. But getting back to the CD, you and I, of course, share this love for music.
Yes.
And when I was listening to the CD, I thought a lot about Duke Ellington. I'll tell you why. Because Ellington, of course, would write these pieces with specific soloist in mind. And I wondered how you decided which, let's just use the soloist to recite these pieces.
Well, I have the great privilege of having my significant other be a wonderful musician by the name of Robbie Robinson, so that was a shoe-in for who would provide the actual played instrumental music on the CD. But I also have wonderful friends with wonderful voices, and when I called them all up, I said, do you want to come in on this? Because even though I wrote the poems, I didn't want to read them all. So my friends include Rose Solari, Sarah Playdell, Cindy Matsakis, whom we just heard, Tanya Young, Sandy Mack, and Dean Hebert. So there's women's voices and then 2 male voices. I think I wanted to specifically have certain voices read certain of the poems, but others I kind of fooled around with. One thing that's on the CD is that Dean Hebert, who's a man, reads a persona poem that's spoken in the voice of a woman. Right. And I like that idea of mixing that up a little bit. Sarah Playdell is British, and I wanted her to specifically read a poem called Letter from a Roman Wife, because I wanted to get that kind of historical weight that I think a British voice specifically has. I asked Rose Solari to read The Farmer's Daughter because, as a poet, Rose is a very strong narrative voice, and this particular poem, for me, is more narrative than lyrical. And Tanya, she's just got this great kind of barroom voice.
That's a great way to describe it.
I wanted her to be my porno witch, Madison. And she said, oh, sure, absolutely. And she did it with great feeling. And then Sandy Mack, another gentleman, had to be the executioner. And I filled in, and Cindy filled in the other poems. So I'm lucky to be surrounded by, as you say, music, both instrumental and human.
Sure. Yeah, so you really were conscious of the oral gifts of these people.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And we recorded, obviously, a lot more poems than got on the CD, and then I ordered them, and I was very surprised, and happily so, to find out that the order worked, the melody of the voices, the different tonalities of the voices, and then Robbie's instrumentation coming in. I think it just worked beautifully.
Now talk a bit about the title. How do you...
Well, Little Wheel is the title of a poem that's also on the CD that I read. And it's a little bit different from other poems of mine, or maybe it just seemed so years ago when I wrote it. The idea of something moving through our life, I make a riff on the little wheel being a gear. It can be a biological process. It's obviously life and death. It's also the physical wheels that are in the world, in my world, the tangible wheels. I just kind of liked that idea of a little wheel, of something that can complicate our lives, but also takes us through our lives. And the poem is kind of associative in the way that the wheel can turn wherever the wheel wants to go. We're helpless, of course, before these wheels.
It's true, yeah. These are much more pleasant than being at, I don't know, Goodyear or somewhere. But anyway, I just thought the metaphor worked very well. I know, that's what I mean.
Man.
The Michelin, yeah.
No, it's not like that.
Could you, I know you have another piece to read before our segment ends, if you could grace our
I will happy to
grace our listeners.
This poem is called My Parents Once Were Rosicrucians. And what I like especially about it is that it's a true story, that indeed my parents once were Rosicrucians. Feet first the light appeared, and then the small gold rest of him. Helmet, cloak, long white beard. He fuzzed but stood his ground. My father wild-eyed with success, my mother stiff with fear, since no one really thought that on some 1940s evening in a post-war housing block, words could carry light, or that time itself would foam along the baseboards like champagne until it took a cartoon shape and stood before their swayback hotel auction bed. But there he was, fruit of my parents' prayers. He must have begun as a belief no bigger than a buttonhole, carried back with them on the bus after they had visited the building with the vessels and the catafalques. They took their little scab of hope or entertainment and waited for the light. Extend yourself. That was the evening's lesson. With the flat red books spread out across the bed, their eyes as slim as lizards, they moved their minds beyond the projects till they imagined a color other than cement, a distance wider than a crib slat. They held hands and said the words until they felt the air ruffle and watched him feather into sight. Imagine his surprise, Mr. Homunculus, old uncle of the ages, when my mother begged my father, send him back, oh, send him back. And my father did just that, waving his arm until his own bones buzzed. There were no rugs, and you can hear the neighbors through the sweat-stained walls, and still my parents said to him, go back, as though he popped out of a catalog instead of God's gold funnel. And so, go back he did, bit by busy bit, a lamp turned on and off. Finally, the room grew small and dark, and after checking on the babies, my parents finally went to sleep, sinking gratefully into their drab tomorrows. Meanwhile, the roaches, moving in and out as always, kept their contract with the other world.
See, only with poetry can you bring Rosicrucians and roaches into
right,
the same
and roaches.
thing. Thank you so much, Sibby.
Thank you.
Thanks to Sibby O'Sullivan, author of Little Wheel and other great works, of course, for appearing on the Coffee House. I'm Reuben Jackson. Alas, I haven't written any of these great works, but this has been Writer's Block.